Hello, hi Kim. Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Um, I wondered if we might just start off with you introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what it is that you do.
Of course. I'm Kim Gilchrist. I am currently a lecturer at the University of Cardiff in the English department there. And my sort of main work, I suppose, is sort of broadly on sort of popular culture, but particularly in terms of my sort of thesis and my ongoing work is on, I suppose, what we call fake history, the mythical history, what we now think of as the mythical history of ancient Britain and how that was performed. People made plays out of that. I mean, the most famous one would be King Lear. A lot of people know that play. But there were lots of plays based on these ancient histories at that sort of Shakespeare's time in the early modern period. And a lot of them people were discovering, and we now know for sure, were based on a completely fictional version of Britain's history. And people were discovering this at the time. So I'm really interested in what it was like to slowly realize that the historical figures you were watching on stage and maybe reading about in books or hearing about in ballads had actually never existed at all. There's a sort of dissonance to that. So that's the main element of most of the work I've done so far.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's almost something, I guess, that every generation since goes through, this kind of realization that one version of history that you're used to seeing is actually needs to be updated and kind of rewritten, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in that sense, it's obviously very relevant to today. And the sort of, a lot of the cultural sort of conflicts that are taking place, and the sort of, maybe not fake, but certainly the hugely biased and distorted versions of history that as you say, every generation, but including our own, has been educated in or whatever. I think, and this definitely feeds into that. But what's slightly different about this is something I had to sort of really think about when I was teaching myself about it, was that this is an entire block of 1,000 years of British history that just never happened. So it's not a reinterpretation or a refocus on different or suppressed parts of evidence or something like that. It was just completely made up by one person. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote this book in the 12th century to account for so there aren't too many books around about our lives in Britain before the Romans. I've found an old one. I'm going to translate it for you. Here it is. We all descended from the Trojans. Here's 1,000 years of history, and that became the tradition. So I think it's quite, one of the things, the problems I had in sort of trying to think about it was that it's sort of, in that way, it's not like anything any of us have experienced. And really anything since that time, unless perhaps certain religious fundamental ideas where there's an idea of the creation of the world or the ancient history of the world that's completely, we would say fictional. We don't really get these entire sort of epochs that just lift out anymore, and it just, there was nothing to replace it with. There was no alternative account back then. Somebody called it at the time a vast blank in the history of Britain. There was just a void, and that sense of that void really interested me. What do you do when it's something that you feel connected to is taken away? More broadly, I guess.
I mean, why did they begin to start challenging this kind of received myth? Because, I mean, when was Geoffrey of Monmouth setting the scene for this kind of fake history, if you like?
He wrote this book. It was called the Historia Regum Britanniae in the 1130s, we think. And there are all sorts of reasons which medievalists know more about than I do about why he might have done that. There might have been political reasons, for example. But it sort of seeped out, and it's another lovely thing about it. It sort of seeped out into the culture that it wasn't intended for. It was intended for sort of elite readers. It was a manuscript, obviously, at that time. And it sort of just became the accepted popular tradition over a sort of, quite fast, but over a sort of couple of hundred years, until it was just sort of in the air, really. It was in ballads, it was in sort of oral culture, it was in plays, and everyone just sort of accepted it. And there are a few people saying, well, hang on, this is a bit, if several of these ancient British kings invaded Rome and conquered it, why don't the Roman histories mention that? That was one of the sort of fault lines. But what happened, the reason it started being called into question was an Italian writer called Polydore Virgil, who had been invited to the English court to write a history of Britain, brought his sort of humanist sort of learning and his sort of his more detached view of things, I guess. He had less investment in being descended from mighty Trojans than maybe the English did. And he started questioning it in his research, and he was applying newer models of how to think and write about history and how to assess evidence and what to use as evidence. And he wrote a book sort of saying, well, I'm not sure King Arthur existed, or I'm not sure Brutus, who was the name of the Trojan who was meant to have come to England, conquered all the giants, and sort of founded Britain. He was just saying, well, there's not, as we might, the evidence isn't here. And he got, first he was shot down by a lot of people because this isn't what anyone wanted to hear. And slowly, this idea sort of seeped out into sort of English historical thinking and writing. But one of the things that I was really hoping to sort of, that excited me about this is that when people say something like King Lear gets talked about, say, oh, well, obviously this is set in mythic Britain, But actually at the time it was a history play, because most people wouldn't have been reading those books that were being more skeptical because they were written in Latin or they were expensive or nobody cared. So for most people, that wasn't, it was only very few people that were aware of these ideas. And it probably took 150 years or so for it to seep out into the wider culture. So while modern academics, we might be saying, well, this is obviously silly. It wasn't silly for people at the time. It was a very real thing. So it did seep out gradually, and sort of there's accounts of people arguing about it in barbers' shops whether Brutus was real or not. Having these sort of heated debates, which I would have loved to have been able to overhear. So it reached a few people, but it didn't reach most people for the longest time. And I've actually found evidence online that some people still believe it.
Oh, really? Gosh, that's so interesting. There were kind of two things there. I guess I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about. And first is that idea of, as you said, how a wider culture becomes made aware of an idea like that, of a change in history, or a myth busting, I suppose, in the sense of what's going on in that period. But the other thing is related to what you said about kind of Polydore Virgil coming over and not having the same kind of investment, perhaps, in a particular version of our history. And I guess one of the things that often gets talked about for the 16th century, the 17th century, is this kind of growing national awareness or kind of nation building. So I wondered how those two things sat together, having this doubt about a very romanticized history at the same time as you're trying to kind of build up national myths.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and when it's written about in the past and in terms of relation to drama, and also in relation to sort of wider sort of cultural, big English literature projects like Spenser's Fairy Queen and things, it's absolutely applied to. I mean, Spenser uses these myths in the Fairy Queen. He uses King Arthur and gives a little potted history of this sort of what I call the Bruton histories, sort of pre-Roman British history. But sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, no. No, I guess I just mean this. There's a kind of important period. It's an important period.
Sorry, nationalism. Sorry, yeah. It's enormously driven by national concerns and a sort of nascent nationalism. And some of the books of John Bale, who's sort of highly kind of Protestant writer, gets very agitated by this early on and writes a book against against sort of the anti-Bruton sort of ideas, against Polydore. And there's a really quite an ugly sort of side of it. And often these writings are really tinged with a sort of xenophobic. They're particularly attacked. I mean, one book talks about pretty much foreigners coming over here trying to sort of meddle with our history. So there is that. That's sort of happening on an intellectual level. I don't know if that's happening on the popular level so much, where people aren't so aware of the debate. And it was used politically, throughout the history. When Edward I wanted to invade Scotland, he used this idea of Brutus founding Britain as an argument that Scotland had always been British. That's in 1301, and Henry VIII did something similar. So this doesn't say they believed in it, but they certainly found it useful. So no, it's absolutely embedded in a sort of growing sense of English nationalism, and it's certainly deployed on the ugliest side of that. It's also deployed when James I wants coming down from Scotland to become King of England as well. in 1602 or 1604 wants to unite England and Scotland. It's used as, as an argument for that in plays of the time. There are a lot of plays on this theme at that time, probably people trying to please him, say, yes, we agree. Or like King Lear saying, look what happens if we don't have a united kingdom, possibly everything falls to pieces and everyone dies. So it's a bit more complex than just being xenophobic or used for sort of xenophobic or nationalist purposes. All that certainly did happen. And again, it can be useful to think about that, at the moment, looking at what's going on and how people use ideas of their national histories, now more sort of acutely, I guess, than has happened in many years, people fighting over visions of what history is. But again, this is slightly different because it's a totally made up sort of 1,000 years of history.
I wonder if you might just rehearse, because I guess some of the visions of this world are quite fun, aren't they? if I recall. So you were talking about pre and post Bruton. Is that a useful
pre and post Bruton? Yeah, I mean that works for me. That works for the purposes of my work. I think I was always worried about that term and whether medievalists and people who study Geoffrey of Monmouth would accept it. Although I have talked about this with a lot of medievalists, and they seem broadly sort of accepting, which is nice. And the reason I call it Bruton is partly to set it before the Romans and from the sort of line of Brutus, because it gets a bit more complicated after that, because there were other histories about Britain that you could also use. So whereas King Arthur was made up by Geoffrey of Monmouth, or sort of made bigger by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the history that he lives in, the sort of Saxon history, was still true. So it's a bit more of a sort of melange, or a bit of a as a patchwork of true and not true things. But the post Bruton, the pre Bruton is completely made up. And if you're asking about sort of the some of the magical things or the sort of strange things, that's what drew me to thinking about it in the first place. There were these wonderful plays. One of them, The Birth of Merlin, that has 2 dragons in it, and a wizard being killed by falling rocks, and that's what sort of got me excited. And I was sort of hoping to find lots of plays like that, to sort of think about plays representing a sort of magical, mythic, slightly absurd to us, sort of Python-esque, Monty Python style sort of Britain. And there's none of that, actually, as it turned out. They're all pretty tragic.
Yeah, it's very the opposite of King Lear, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's it. King Lear, and there's no magic in hardly any of them. They're quite sort of political and quite. A lot of them are quite bleak. Locrine, which was not a very well-known one, but that's about really sort of Brutus's sons. That has, I think, 6 suicides in it. For example, I discovered it was a sort of dark history, so I was hoping to have quite a sort of light-hearted time of it. But actually ended up sort of having to tackle some. It's quite a dark vision of Britain for people who want to have meant so much to people, I suppose. And the plays that were chosen from those, the sections from those narratives that people chose to write plays about, or certainly the plays that survived, are often fairly tragic. It's interesting that people were often choosing those themes. Although the original play of King Lear, obviously everyone knows King Lear is a terrible tragedy where everyone dies. In the historical version of it, of that story, no one dies. It's actually a happy story. Cordelia rescues him from France. They come over with an army. They reconquer sort of Goneril and Regan, and Lear becomes king again. And that's how the original play ends. It's a sort of almost a comedy. Everyone's happy. And Shakespeare changed the ending, and everyone wonders why. So that was sort of fun play, the original King Lear. But in general, there's not a lot of magic and not a lot of fun, which I wasn't expecting when I set out to sort of write on it for as many years as I did.
And that's interesting, isn't it? That kind of touch point of King Lear, I guess, as a way of understanding how the Elizabethan period envisaged that past or played around with it. Because I mean, you mentioned the happy ending to King Lear, which is the received tradition. But I guess there's a sort of amusement that 100 years after, well, however many years after Shakespeare, you get the post-restoration King Lear, which also puts it rewrites Shakespeare's plays to put a happy ending on. But actually, that's perhaps truer to this tradition. Is that right?
It's absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of restoration one meddles about with it even more. But that's I think that was normal for writing plays about the past. You sort of weren't expected, if you got the moral message, that was sort of okay. And also a bit, and this speaks into sort of the popular culture thing against the, let's say the playgoing culture, the broad playgoing culture against, say, the few people who could afford or read or cared about history books, was that the narratives of history that people got came from all sorts of different directions. So they were a real sort of patchwork anyway. The original play of King Lear, it sort of broadly follows, say, the historical version, but it's also got two clowns and a sort of scheming villain, and they're all Christian, which isn't bad, which is interesting for a story that's meant to take place about 600 years BC or BCE. So to take a non-sort of Bruton example, the George Peele's play of King Edward I, again, it's a history play, but it has one section where Queen Eleanor sinks down into the ground as a very strange punishment for some sin, and then re-emerges at Charing Cross to the amazement of passers-by. Now we'd say, okay, that's obviously a silly thing and that's not history. But there were ballads, these were taken from ballads. And actually one of them got the Queen Eleanor wrong. It's actually meant to be a different Queen Eleanor from a different time. But this was just as much history for a lot of people. Something that had happened or something that had probably happened, as the versions that sort of more elite readers or playgoers or we might accept as being historic. But they were just as much things that could have happened or had happened ago in the past, back then. And so this sort of melange of things is all equally acceptable, I think, and actually was probably the version of history that most people had. These plays and ballads probably was history. It's not that this was a different version of history for them, different to something they might read in the book. They weren't reading books, a lot of them. They were going to plays. The plays were history. So that's took primacy for them.
That kind of popular history notion that we have quite clearly now. There's a whole genre of podcasts you can listen to, of history programs and channels. I mean, is that so that's something that Elizabethans, for instance, who are hungry for a new version or an older version of history, that's where they're consuming it then, is it, in this kind of artistic and creative manner?
I think it really, or rather, one thing that I found, and again, this is just like today as well, is it really depends on what one scholar has called your textual community. So that's not just defined by, say, sort of social class or something like that. It's defined by the stories and the books that you and the people within your community share, your sort of shared narratives, and also your shared mediums through which you get your information. So today, with the particular grouping that you share, you do or I do, where we recommend podcasts to each other or articles or plays or whatever, and that's our textual community, and that's going to have certain sort of political or kind of various other sort of unspoken similarities that we all sort of unconsciously agree on, I think.
Like a social media bubble, as they say.
Absolutely great. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a textual community back then was something quite similar. So you might be somebody who was interested in history, so you might be able to afford, say, a small chronicle book. Let's say you're sort of off the middling culture, which I know you're sort of working on. And you'd be interested in history of your city. A lot of people wrote their own family histories in the back of chronicles, so they're sort of connecting their families to the wider kind of history of a city or of a country. So you can read that, and they even made small versions which seem to be able to sort of sextidecimo, which is absolutely tiny, and which it seems to be able to be sort of carried around in your pockets. So it's sort of handy, so you can sort of check things in conversation. So you might also be going to a play, you might also be listening to ballads, but you might not have access to some of those more sort of thorough or up to date or sort of intellectually sort of rigorous history books. So that's your textual community. That's where you're getting your idea of the past from, and you're probably choosing those things partly on what you can afford, on what is accessible to you. You know, reading very specialized books in any era is alienating and difficult unless you're specially trained in how to do that. You know, so it's out of reach for a lot of people on educational and economics, sort of, you know, for those reasons. But again, like today, I think, you know, people were also choosing which version of the past or versions of the past they subscribe to based on what was useful for them and their community. What do you want to believe? You know, it's nicer to believe, isn't it, that we're descended from Trojans? You know, if you're an Elizabethan, you know, if you're an Elizabethan, you know, rather than having no knowledge of your history before your island was invaded by the Romans, for example. It gives you, there are all sorts of reasons why that would feel better than having nothing. So I think there's an affective, you know, a sort of an emotional, often these histories are talked about as something intellectual that we do by gathering evidence and deciding on what's most likely and then presenting the facts. But actually, you know, again, as today we're saying, and certainly at the time, I think it's much more to do with emotion. And what binds you together. And again, like you said, there's a real nationalist sort of, there's a lot of danger to that kind of thinking as well. But I think people held on to these things partly because they wanted to, because it was better than the alternative for all sorts of reasons, and it was scary, I think, to disagree, because that's another part of being part of a community, isn't it? If you're the one saying, actually, hang on, that can be that can come with repercussions. That can come with sort of serious consequences. And there's certainly one of the big books that is sort of seen as finishing all of this. Is a book called Britannia by Camden, and he sort of writes against the history. Says actually the evidence seems to suggest that Brutus never existed. And it's a Latin book, and he was a serious scholar, and so it's taken as being the moment when, you know, all that silliness was finished with. And obviously it was in Latin, so not many people read it. But he also says, basically, far be it for me to impugn the wonders of Brutus. I can't really say for sure. You know, it's certainly not much better, isn't it? I don't want to upset anybody. He's really hedging his bets. It's almost like he's nervous to say it because he knows he's going to being a whistleblower or something. You know, he knows he's opening himself up to a lot of criticism or a lot of attacks even. You know, so there are all sorts of reasons for hanging on to something, even when the doubt might set him, for sort of trying to sustain it. And that's partly why I think the plays like King Lear are so interesting, because they seem to have some of that doubt in them. What was it like to watch a play about King Lear when you no longer had any clue if he lived or not? All sort of dissonance and disturbance and ideas of melting away and things that happen in that play. In fact, they all just get eradicated at the end. If you just read some of these doubtful books and you weren't sure anymore about your own inheritance, your own ancestry, then you go to see a play like King Lear. It must be quite a dissonant, disturbing experience. Maybe that's what I imagined anyway.
So it's a sense of kind of watching history merge into myth, I suppose, in this kind of dramatic reimagining of what we're used to seeing.
That's absolutely how how people have always talked about it, and that seems to be what happens. And what happens just after King Lear, if we stick to Shakespeare for a moment, is Cymbeline, which is set at the very, very end of this sort of period, just after the Romans have invaded, that sort of time. And of course, there's no historical content to it at all. It's almost a complete fairy tale. I mean, that one does have lots of magic in it, obviously, actually, of Jupiter descending on the eagle and sort of various other sort of strangenesses in it. But I was thinking about it because they're often talked about as being mythic. And I really had started thinking, what do we mean when we say myth? What is myth? And obviously it's a big word, and it gets used a lot. And I don't know, other people might disagree with this. I don't know what you think, but the sort of working definition of myth that I came up with for myself was you know, something that has a sort of cultural tradition that where the origins of it are sort of lost, and we know it's not true, or we sort of, even though we often behave as if it is, and it has a sort of wider allegorical or so the Greek myths, you know, the perfect sort of example, meaning for our culture. We can use it to describe things, even though we know it's not true. We can use it to talk about ourselves or, you know, bigger issues. And that's where I think we can't call it mythic, these histories, because we don't do that with any of it, because it just died. I think one of the reasons for that is that it's not an organic tradition the way the Greek myths were. They're lost, so we don't know where they come from. Whereas this is just based on one person making it up and fooling everybody. So I think that shuts off its opportunities, you know, the way that it could have that sense of sort of shared something. Once you take it back to that source of one person, the sense that it could be something larger, I think, becomes almost impossible. And certainly it was just by the end of the 17th century, really, it's completely gone. Cymbeline, I think the last play that we have to use any of that, really. And in the last drama, not really a play, that talks about any of these figures, which is Mask at Ludlow Castle, which was written by John Milton. This figure of Sabrina, who's the daughter of Locrine, who was the first king of England, who right at the start of British history gets drowned in a river, completely not her own fault. It's terrible. In Milton's Mask, the mask's about something completely different, but she suddenly rises, it's the River Severn, she suddenly rises up out of the river as a spirit, as a sort of goddess, and then rescues the characters from the trouble they're in. So that's where it almost becomes mythic, this historical character being sort of transformed into a sort of mythical figure, a goddess, which is what happened, I think, you know, people argue, to the Greek gods. But that it stops there, because there's no wider tradition, there's no broader sort of thing. It's a sort of elite game by that point. So I didn't really know what to call it after that. I don't know if you got any ideas, but mythic didn't really work for me after that. I thought, well, it hasn't survived, has it? And it didn't last for very long, you know, even then.
I want to make it perhaps even more complicated. I wonder if I might ask about how, I guess that there's a kind of strand of historiography or of ways of doing history, certainly that came out of the 1970s and 1980s, you know, that I guess starts to ask the same sort of questions of the way we do history now that they might have been asking about Geoffrey of Monmouth. So that line at which what we would consider myth, or even not myth in this, just complete fabrication, bleeds over into the type of work that we're doing when you're trying to unpick, you know, what did an Elizabethan think? You know, how was a Shakespearean play put on? This is all kinds of history that we're doing, where the past, you know, we're working off narratives of our own about this past. I don't know if, I mean, for instance, I was just currently looking at some documents in Chester where the original documents don't exist, many of them, but they're copied out by an antiquarian. You know, so you're kind of always working through this facsimile to try to get to well, on origin, which is a very problematic idea in itself. I don't know. I mean, is there a kind of modern methodological parallel to this kind of work?
I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's about questions of evidence and what do we consider evidence, and how far are we willing to go with our own or sense of authority in interpreting that evidence. I think you're right. That seems to have really changed over the last years, isn't it? You know, the old vision was that your job is to say this is what it was, whereas now maybe we're kind of invited to be more sort of skeptical and worried about saying anything, you know, productively in a useful way, in a way that's maybe more honest as well. And this sort of palimpsest styles of evidence that you talk about. I think it's Henry Herbert, you know, the Master of the Revels. A lot of his records only are recovered from a notebook of his that was kept by somebody else, who then chopped out the bits about Shakespeare and sort of pasted them into another book. So we have what that person 100 years, I don't know, was it 100 years, 150 years ago, whatever, was interested in. So we've only got their version and we can try and read between, well, we can't read between the lines because the lines have been chopped with scissors, but how confident can we be, I suppose, and how aware should we be of our own cultural, what's the word, sort of situatedness? Am I making that up? With our own position in a moment in time and our own limitations to only be able to see so far from within our sort of cultural constraints. I don't know if I'm answering what you're sort of raising, but the main methodological thing that I sort of try and keep in the back of my head is to try and be honest and say, maybe, is this possible, and to never present anything as a fact, and to offer the possibility, the interpretative possibility, maybe they are impossibilities, of whatever it is we're working with, especially when we're looking at such fragmentary and sort of mediated evidence and records and documents. And at the time, that's partly why this all the sort of the account of history that I looked at, why it felt a bit, that was one of your first questions, I suppose, in that period, because people were doing that more often. Certainly in a certain sort of in certain territories or certain textual communities, they were changing how they decided and interpreted what old documents were telling them. Before, it was just tradition. So you figured out what had happened in the past by going back to old books, and actually it was sort of the opposite to the way we work now. Quite often, in terms of scholarship, quite often the oldest books were considered the most authoritative. So that's partly why Geoffrey Monmouth probably became more authoritative for a while, because it was getting older and older. But then that obviously really creates a tunnel vision, because your only authority is the previous authority, and that authority, all of them are sort of repeating each other, really. And that's how traditions, and that was how you decided if something was authoritative or not, was because it was really old, and the more recent people had also repeated that information. And we don't do that now, but people started looking more broadly and looking at who had written things and why. This idea of, well, the Romans, okay, it's a good example. The Romans didn't write about the British invading and conquering Rome. That's a bit suspect. And for Polydore Virgil, that was seen as maybe this didn't happen. Otherwise, the Romans probably would, they might have mentioned it. But for the people defending Geoffrey of Monmouth, that was evidence that the Romans were jealous and had left it out because they were embarrassed, because they didn't want it to be recorded in their histories.
Which is also, I guess, a skeptical vision of the way history works, and not inaccurate.
Well, that's it. A lot of the arguments they were using weren't bad methodologies. What I think it was Polydore Virgil or George Buchanan, who is a Scottish sort of intellectual and writer, also wrote against the the reality of Brutus and these ancient Britons. And I forget which book, but one of the arguments was, well, Brutus was meant to have seen a vision of the goddess Diana, who led him to Britain on his travels. But in the record, I think I'm getting this, I might be getting this wrong. She speaks to him in the record. She speaks to him in Latin, and yet this was happening 1,000 years before the Romans. So she couldn't have been speaking in Latin, which proves that this history is made up. Now, one of the defenders, so he's on the right side of history because he's arguing that it's nonsense. But one of the defenders of the British history, the Bruton histories, said, well, that doesn't mean anything, does it? We always record things in our most recent language. Geoffrey wrote Latin, so he's saying that in Latin. That doesn't prove anything. He's quite right. He's defending something that's was wrong, but he's doing it, using a perfectly a better argument than the person, making it, who's actually correct. Again, I don't know how this goes back to your question, but
no, that's interesting, isn't it? That kind of
just, but again, that's about the emotional undercurrent. He's making that argument. I mean, it's a good argument, but he's making it because he feels he has to, because he's got an emotional investment in these histories being true. So what's driving him is not the intellectual sort of scrupulousness. It's, again, but that does go back to maybe what you're asking. It's his precise historical and cultural position and moment as somebody English who wants this, who needs this history to be true, and so he's fighting. This is Richard Harvey, ABL Harvey's brother. He really wants and needs it to be true for all sorts of reasons, and that's what's driving his intellectual effort. And again, I think it does speak to how we maybe try and write and think about history today, is to try and check ourselves for what's my intellectual investment in this. You know, is it about holding up a particular cultural idea or tradition or sort of particular kind of narrow perspective? Is it because I want to be right about something? You know, if I had this idea and I really want it to be true because it's exciting, or it'll help me if it is. So I guess maybe that's something about how we think and write about these things, is what's my emotional, affective need here, and maybe to also admit that it's impossible to be totally detached. And to be honest about that, I don't know.
I mean, one of the things that your work is doing, and what you kind of talked about there, is drawing these kind of wide, big questions about history, and yeah, and I'm sorry for throwing that one at you because it's really complicated. And putting it into line with kind of creative and cultural outputs like plays. And I know that you have a book forthcoming that's doing that kind of work.
April 2021.
There we go. But a link to it. And so one of the questions that we're asking or contributors on here is about that idea of literature and the term literature or its concept. So I mean, how does that fit into the way you think about this, or generally? I mean, what does the term literature mean to you?
These days, I mean, that's a good question. It's changed a lot over the years, actually. I think when I was younger, it might have meant sort of self-discovery. I was, sort of reading, one reads, or seeks out art. It could be music, visual art, whatever, literature, to sort of test one's responses to it. To sort of, I like this. What does it say about me? This book moved me. Why did it move me? Do I identify with the protagonist? Whatever. Do I want to be the singer in that band? Whatever. It's a sort of part of that sort of self-fashioning, I suppose. These days, actually, and these sort of studies have really changed this for me. It's more about everybody else, maybe about the culture and what a work of art or a work of literature or a play can teach us about the time in which it was created and the people for whom it had meaning, or multiple meanings. And in that way, it could be almost any sort of cultural product. But I think drama, is especially immediate, especially visceral and physical and complex. And so many people are coming together to give it meaning and to make it happen and to carry those experiences away with them. So it's almost a sort of extraordinary opportunity to try and explore and try and discover what it was like back then. I don't know what these things can tell us about the people who made them and the people who watched them and the people who were moved by it or who were made angry by it or wanted to stop it. So literature for me now, I think, is, if anything, is an opportunity to really engage more and to try and ask questions about culture. And obviously that's always a personal experience as well. So maybe it's still about sort of a personal journey, but I also think that's why it's so useful for us now, because we can apply that to everything around us, particularly again at the moment. Those skills. What does this film say? What does this play say? What does this novel say about who's making it? Why are they making it? What's their agenda? Who are they making it for? What are they leaving out? What are they emphasizing? So I guess maybe it's become more political for me than it was when I was younger. But a combination of all those things, I suppose.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Kim. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of bring up in the conversation before we say goodbye?
No. Oh, one thing, just briefly. I was talking about Richard Harvey a moment ago, and he wrote this short, angry book about the Bruton histories. And I just want to tell you this because I just think it's brilliant. Apparently, he was so renowned for his terrible temper and his sort of argumentativeness. They literally put a play on about him when he was at Cambridge, called Dunce Furience, I think, like the raging dunce. And when the play was on, he got so angry, he rushed in and smashed the windows. And he was stopped from doing this and put in the stocks by, I think, the provost or the vice chancellor or something like that, so that the provost or the vice chancellor could finish watching the play. So that tells you something about the people who were defending these histories, anyway, or some of them. I just found that out a few weeks ago. It's just a lovely, lovely little story about an angry man a long time ago.
No,
maybe that's why I like literature. Learn stories like that.
Yeah, what an image to finish on. I love it.
Dunce Furience. Too many of those around these days, anyway.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevin. Take care.